Master Ilara knew there was no magic there, only the promise of a hard fight. The castle was a labyrinth of rubble, the ceiling dripped in countless spots, and the echo of his footsteps was lost in the empty chambers. But he had promised his deceased wife that he would take care of the boys, and a former soldier doesn't give up. With the help of his older grandsons, he began to clean the moss from the walls, to pile stones, to improvise a fire in what had been a great hall, and to mend cracks with mud and branches. The threat was not a monster, but the harsh winter that was approaching, the hunger gnawing at their stomachs, and the scorn of the village that had banished them to that cursed place. Each day was a battle against the elements, a test of his resilience, as Kyle and Finn helped remove the rubble from an old blocked passage, hoping to find a more sheltered spot. Their shovels struck something hard and hollow. Beneath the cold stones and damp earth lay a dark wooden chest, adorned with symbols of a long-forgotten king. The metallic sound, a muffled echo in the damp earth, froze Leah and Maya's shovels. It wasn't the crack of a common stone, nor the scrape of a stubborn root. It was something deeper, more resonant. Ilara, the grandmother who was supervising the construction of the stone wall, felt a shiver. Her eyes, marked by years of labor and sorrow, fixed on the spot where the shovels had stopped. Little Sophia, the youngest granddaughter who had been playing with a stick until then, approached curiously, sensing the change in the air. "What was that, girls?" Ilara's voice was a hoarse whisper, laden with a caution that life had taught her. Leah, the eldest, 12 years old with the strength of a small oak, knelt. With her hands, she began to clear away the loose earth, revealing a dark, aged surface. Maya, a year younger, joined her, her breath caught. Soon, the shape of a rectangular, massive object began to emerge. It wasn't a rock, it was something made, crafted. Grandmother Ilara approached, her heart beating an irregular rhythm. Her wrinkled fingers touched the dark wood, almost petrified by the soil's dampness. Strange symbols, etched in oxidized metal, adorned the lid. Spirals, intertwined lines, figures that looked like ancient runes from a forgotten time. A king, legend whispered, had been buried with his treasures in the cursed lands beyond the village. But that was just a tale to scare children, wasn't it? The reality was they were hungry, exiled, building a stone hut with their bare hands to survive the impending winter. The discovery of a chest there, beneath the foundation of their last refuge, was a shock that swung between terror and an almost insane hope. "It's a chest," Maya managed to murmur, her eyes wide. Ilara felt the weight of history and mystery. The chest was heavy, firmly anchored in the earth. It took hours under the setting sun to unearth it completely. Each piece of earth removed revealed more of the dark wood, the heavy ironwork, the enigmatic symbols. Little Sophia helped carry the loose stones, not understanding the magnitude of what was happening, but sensing the tension in the air. When the chest was finally free, it revealed itself to be an impressive object. It was almost 1 meter long and half a meter wide, with solid iron handles on each side, now corroded. The padlock, a complex and rusted piece of engineering, seemed impossible to open. "Should we open it, Grandma?" Leah asked, her voice trembling between excitement and fear. Ilara hesitated. The village's superstition about the cursed lands echoed in her mind. What if it was a trap? A curse, but hunger was a more real curse, and the approaching cold, a tangible enemy. Curiosity and hopelessness overcame fear. With the rudimentary tools they had, a worn pickaxe and an iron bar they used to move stones, Ilara and Leah attacked the padlock. The sound of metal striking metal echoed in the solitude of the valley. Maya watched, hands covering her mouth, while Sophia cowered behind her grandmother. It took time, sweat, and the willpower of those who had nothing left to lose. Finally, with a sharp creak and a dry snap, the padlock gave way. The silence that followed was deafening. The air seemed denser, heavy with anticipation. Ilara, with trembling hands, knelt and with a final effort lifted the heavy lid. A golden glow burst from the chest's darkness, flooding the twilight with a warm, unreal light. It wasn't copper coins, nor dusty relics. It was gold. Piles and piles of gold coins, jewels encrusted with precious stones, crowns and bracelets that seemed to have come straight out of a fairy tale. The brilliance was so intense, it seemed to warm the cold air around them. The three granddaughters gasped in unison. Leah's mouth opened, but no words came out. Maya began to cry, tears of pure disbelief and relief streaming down her dirty face. Sophia, the smallest, pointed at the glow, an innocent, dazzled smile on her lips. Ilara, however, did not cry. Her eyes, which had seen so much misfortune, now saw the promise of a life. But along with the promise came a new and terrible truth. The gold was a secret that, if discovered, could be more dangerous than hunger or cold. The village that had banished them, the men who had driven them out, would not hesitate to take everything. The chest of gold was their salvation, but also the greatest threat they had ever faced. Ilara looked at her granddaughters, at the golden glow dancing on their faces. The stone hut, which once seemed a refuge, now needed to become a fortress. Winter was no longer their only concern. Now they had something to protect, and the night, falling fast, brought with it not just the cold, but also the shadow of a new and dangerous challenge. An ancient king's treasure had been found, and with it, the promise of a life, but also the certainty that the fight was just beginning. The golden glow, so intense it seemed to have a life of its own, danced in the granddaughter's wide eyes. But for Ilara, it was a beacon of danger. There was no time for ecstasy. Night was falling, and with it the biting cold and the darkness that could hide both salvation and ruin. The chest, open and gleaming, was an invitation to misfortune. With an abrupt movement, Ilara pushed the heavy lid of the chest back into place, muffling the glow and the clinking sound of coins. The silence that followed was even more oppressive than the revelation. "No one can know," she whispered, her voice hoarse, almost a growl. "No one. Ever." Her eyes swept across the desolate valley, the distant silhouette of the village that had spat them out, the darkening sky. The secret was a burden heavier than the gold itself. Leah, the eldest, understood the gravity in her grandmother's words. Her 12 years, forged in life's harshness, had taught her that wealth for the disadvantaged was a sentence. "What will we do, Grandma?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. Maya, still softly sobbing, hugged Sophia, who clung to her grandmother, sensing the urgency in the air without fully understanding. The first task was to hide the treasure. The chest was too large and heavy to be moved easily. The hut's foundation, where they had found it, was the only place that offered any disguise. With already calloused hands, Ilara, Leah, and Maya began to push the earth back over the chest, covering it with the same stones that would form the hut's wall. Each stone placed was an act of desperation and hope, a brick in the fortress of their secret. Sweat ran down their foreheads, mixing with earth and tears. The hut, once a symbol of their resilience against nature, now became a hiding place against human malice. The cold night wind howled, and every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves seemed like an approaching step. Paranoia was a shadow that stretched with the darkness. Ilara knew that the village, with its curious eyes and hearts full of scorn, would not be far if news of the treasure spread. They had been expelled for being a burden. Now, with gold, they would be a target. Inside the makeshift hut, with the gold chest once again buried beneath what would be the floor of their only refuge, the air was thick. The fire's warmth barely kept out the cold from outside, but it couldn't dispel the chill that ran down their spines. Ilara sat, hands crossed over her knees, eyes fixed on the flames. The gold was there, beneath their feet, a promise and a threat. "We cannot speak of this to anyone," Ilara repeated, looking at her granddaughters. "Not a whisper, not a dream. If anyone knows, everything we have will be taken from us, and perhaps more." The gravity of her words weighed on the girls. Leah nodded, her lips pressed tight. Maya, still frightened, hugged Sophia tighter. The little one, oblivious to the danger, fell asleep in her sister's arms, perhaps dreaming of the glow she had seen. The night was long and sleepless for Ilara. Her mind, once focused on daily survival, now seethed with strategies: how to protect the treasure, how to use it without revealing its source. The stone hut needed to be more than a shelter. It needed to be impenetrable. She needed a real door, windows that could be locked, thicker walls. But how to get materials without raising suspicion? Winter was approaching, and hunger was still a reality, even with a treasure beneath their feet. Gold couldn't be eaten, couldn't warm them directly. It needed to be exchanged, but at what cost? The nearest village was the only place to get supplies, and there every face was familiar, every gaze a judgment. Ilara remembered the legends about the ancient king, the one who, they said, had been buried with his treasure in the cursed lands. The irony was cruel. What the village considered cursed was now their only blessing, but the legends also spoke of guardians, of curses for those who profaned the king's rest. Ilara, a woman of practical faith, did not believe in ghosts, but the village's superstition was a powerful tool. Could she use that belief to her advantage? At dawn, the pale sun barely managed to pierce the cold mist that covered the valley. Ilara rose, her body aching, but her mind clearer. The fight had not ended with the discovery of gold. It had merely changed form. From a battle against nature, it transformed into a war of wits and secrets against human greed. "Today," she told her granddaughters, who were waking up huddled near the fire, "we will finish the wall, and we will build a door, strong, and we will find more stones. Many stones." Her eyes, once tired, now shone with renewed determination. The gold chest was not just a fortune, it was the promise of a future she would fight with all her might to protect. The stone hut would not just be a home, it would be a king's vault, and they, its guardians. The fight was just beginning, and Ilara knew that each day would be a step on the tightrope between salvation and perdition. The sun, a pale and indifferent disk, barely managed to dissipate the mist clinging to the valley that morning. But for Ilara, there was no time to contemplate the melancholic beauty of dawn. The discovery of gold had transformed the urgency of survival into a race against time and human greed. The stone hut, once a simple shelter, needed to become a fortress, and quickly. "Today," Ilara declared, her voice hoarse from the sleepless night, but filled with a new and fierce determination, "we will finish the wall, and we will build a door, strong, and we will find more stones, many stones." Leah, Maya, and Sophia, still huddled near the dying embers of the fire, felt the weight of her words. Sophia's innocence was the only light amidst the shadow of worry that hung over the others. The day unfolded in a whirlwind of hard work. Every stone Ilara and Leah carried, every piece of clay Maya mixed for the mortar, was a brick in the wall of their secret. Their hands, already calloused, now bled and ached. But the physical pain was a small price to pay for the promise of security. The hut began to take shape, its stone walls rising with a solidity that once seemed unattainable. Ilara, with the experience of a lifetime of privations, knew that strength came not only from stone, but from the unwavering will to protect what was hers. The door was the next priority. They couldn't have an open entrance to the world, an invitation to curiosity and covetousness. Using the most robust logs they had collected and some old planks found adrift in the river, Ilara and Leah, with Maya's help, who held the pieces while her grandmother fitted them, began to build a heavy rustic door. Each blow of the improvised hammer was a sound of defiance against the silent valley. The chest's padlock, now useless, was repurposed, hammered, and adapted for the new door, an ironic symbol of their new reality. As they worked, Ilara's mind seethed. The gold was there, beneath their feet, but it was useless if they couldn't use it. And using it meant going to the village that had expelled them, that saw them as outcasts. How could she appear with money, even a little, without raising suspicion? Hunger was still a reality. Winter was approaching with its icy grip, and provisions were scarce. "Grandma," Leah asked as they tried to fit a particularly heavy stone, "how will we buy food and blankets? It's getting very cold." The question echoed Ilara's own concern. Ilara paused, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "I will go to the village," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, "but I cannot go empty-handed. I will need something to sell." The idea of using the gold directly was unthinkable. They needed a story, a facade. The solution came from an old memory of a time when the family still owned a small piece of land. There was a small mine of special clay, which her own grandmother used to extract to make simple pots and bowls. It was arduous work, but the clay was valued for its durability. "We will dig for clay," Ilara announced. "It's dirty work, but it's honest, and it will give us a reason to have some coins." In the following days, the routine of building the hut mingled with the arduous task of digging for clay. It was a thin layer, hidden beneath the earth, but Ilara knew exactly where to look. Leah and Maya, though exhausted, worked with new energy, fueled by hope. Sophia, meanwhile, played with pieces of clay, molding small figures that seemed to add a touch of normalcy to their precarious existence. With the hut almost complete, the sturdy walls and heavy door in place, Ilara began to prepare for her journey to the village. She chose only a few gold coins, the smallest and most worn, so they would seem ancient and less valuable. She carefully hid them in a small cloth pouch sewn into her clothes. The rest of the gold would remain buried, a secret beneath their feet. Before leaving, Ilara looked at her granddaughters, her eyes tired but firm. "Leah, you are the eldest. Take care of your sisters. No one comes in here, and you don't go out. If anyone asks, say we are just building our home, as we always have, and that the land here is difficult. That luck has not smiled upon us." She knew that the village's superstition about the cursed lands could be their best defense. If people believed the place was unfortunate, perhaps they wouldn't come too close. The journey to the village was an ordeal. Every step was a reminder of the rejection they had suffered. The curious glances, the whispers, the coldness of the merchants. Ilara kept her head high, her face a mask of weariness and resignation. She sold the clay for a fair price, but not enough for their needs. Then, with a pounding heart, she used one of the gold coins. "I found some old coins while digging," she lied to the merchant. "A fat, suspicious man. Maybe they're not worth much, but I need food and blankets for my granddaughters." The merchant examined the coin, his eyes narrowed. The gleam of the gold was undeniable, even if the piece was small. He weighed it, tested it, and finally, with a shrug, accepted it. "It's good gold," he grumbled, "but it's not worth much these days. What will you take?" Ilara bought the essentials: flour, some dried vegetables, a piece of salted meat, and thick blankets. She felt the gazes of the other villagers who noticed her unusual purchases. "Strange thing," she heard someone murmur. "Old Ilara, buying so much. Where did she get the money?" She ignored them, her heart heavy. The first exchange had been successful, but the danger was palpable. Curiosity was a flame that, if fed, could turn into an uncontrollable fire. Back at the hut, her granddaughter's relief at seeing her return with supplies was a balm to her soul. The warm food and soft blankets brought a long-forgotten comfort. But night brought back vigilance. Ilara knew the village wouldn't forget. Whispers would spread. The story of the old widow who found some ancient coins would be distorted, exaggerated. She looked at the stone walls, at the sturdy door. It was a good start, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed a plan to ward off the curious, to turn suspicion into fear. The legend of the cursed lands, of the buried king and his curses, was the only weapon she had. And Ilara was willing to use it. The stone hut, built with sweat and secrets, now needed to become a sanctuary of mystery, a place no one would dare disturb. The fight for survival had transformed into a war of nerves, and Ilara knew that each day was a new battlefield. The stone hut, once a refuge of despair, was now the epicenter of a silent strategy. Ilara knew that the strength of the walls was not enough. She needed an invisible barrier, one that fed on fear and ignorance. The legend of the cursed lands, of the ancient king and his curse, was the seed she would plant in the villagers' minds. In the days that followed her first risky trip to the village, Ilara intensified her work on the hut, but with a different purpose. It wasn't just to build, but to shape an image. She and Leah piled stones more irregularly, as if the earth itself resisted construction. They left twisted pieces of wood and dry branches hanging, creating dancing shadows and strange shapes in the flickering light of the night fire. Maya, with her artistic innocence, was encouraged to draw rustic symbols on the smoother stones, figures that Ilara said were to ward off evil spirits, but which were actually just childish scribbles that, through the lens of superstition, could be interpreted as archaic runes. "Grandma, what are these drawings?" Sophia asked, pointing to a distorted sun Maya had etched. "They are ancient secrets, my little one," Ilara replied, her voice grave, "to protect our home from curious eyes." Each dawn, Ilara went out to collect firewood, but also to leave small clues around the hut. An animal bone carefully positioned, a pile of stones in an unusual pattern, a piece of old fabric tied to a branch. These were subtle details, almost imperceptible, but which, if noticed, would feed the narrative that something strange and perhaps dangerous resided in those lands. The village, as Ilara expected, buzzed with whispers. The story of the old widow who had returned with supplies and ancient coins spread like wildfire. Curiosity was aflame, but Ilara was determined to turn it into smoke of fear. "I heard that old Ilara is building a house in the cursed lands," a villager commented in the market, "and that she found something there, something that shouldn't have been touched." "Yes," another replied, "and they say her hut has a strange aura, that ravens gather there in unusual numbers, and that the howls of wolves are stronger near its walls." Ilara, on her next visit to the village, acted with calculated melancholy. Her eyes were deeper set, her body seemed more stooped. She spoke little, answering questions with monosyllables and heavy sighs. When asked about the ancient gold, she shook her head. "It's a curse, not a blessing," she murmured. "The land here is difficult, and what it gives, it also takes." She bought only the strictly necessary, paying with the most worn gold coins, always with the same story of having found them while digging. Her demeanor was that of someone carrying a burden, not a fortune. The tactic worked. The villagers' initial curiosity began to mix with a latent fear. No one wanted to get too close to the cursed lands, especially if old Ilara, known for her resilience, seemed so dejected. The idea that she had profaned something and was now paying the price was more palatable than that she had found a fortune. Leah, however, felt the weight of the deception. She watched her grandmother with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. "Grandma," she asked one night as the icy wind whistled through the door's cracks. "Isn't it wrong to deceive people like this?" Ilara hugged her, the smell of smoke and earth on her clothes. "It's not deception, my dear, it's protection. If they think we are cursed, they will leave us in peace, and the only curse we have here is hunger and cold if we are not clever." Winter deepened, and the need for supplies was constant. With each trip to the village, Ilara felt the villagers' gaze, now less of curiosity and more of a superstitious respect. Some even avoided her path. She had become a somber figure, a living reminder of the legends they so feared. But the deception had its limits. The gold, though abundant, was a finite resource if used so sporadically, and the cold was relentless. The hut, despite being sturdy, was still cold. Ilara needed more firewood, more blankets, more food. One afternoon, as Ilara and Leah were collecting stones to reinforce the hut's base, they heard a noise, a branch breaking, a muffled whisper. Ilara stopped, her heart pounding. "Be quiet," she hissed. A man from the village, a hunter named Thomas, who had always been more skeptical than the others, had ventured too close. He had noticed Ilara's clues, but his curiosity was stronger than his fear. He wanted to see what old Ilara was doing in those lands. As he approached the hut, he saw the girls and smoke rising from the makeshift chimney. He didn't see a curse. He saw only a family struggling. Ilara, noticing his approach, acted quickly. She picked up a twisted piece of wood and thrust it into the ground forcefully. As if performing a ritual, she began to murmur unintelligible words, her voice low and hoarse, but audible in the forest's silence. She looked directly in Thomas's direction, her eyes fixed and empty, as if looking through him. Thomas felt a shiver down his spine. The scene was disturbing. Old Ilara, whom he knew as a practical woman, seemed to have gone mad. He didn't see the gold. He didn't see the hut as a vault. He saw only the figure of a woman who seemed to be under the sway of something ancient and dark. Thomas's skepticism wavered. He turned and ran, fear finally overcoming his curiosity. Ilara watched his departure, a sigh of relief escaping her lips. The tactic had worked, but each time the risk increased. The line between protection and perdition was thin, and she knew that one day the deception might not be enough. The gold chest remained beneath their feet, a weight and a promise. The stone hut was now a sanctuary of mystery, but the outside world was a hungry predator, and Ilara knew that the war of wits was far from over. She needed more, a plan that would guarantee not only their safety, but the permanence of her secret. Before winter and human greed swallowed them whole, the burning sensation on Ilara's back, where Thomas's eyes had rested, lingered long after the hunter's flight. The tactic had worked, yes, but with each success, the line between deception and truth seemed to blur. The chest, hidden beneath the stone floor, was a heart beating beneath the earth, pulsing with a promise and a danger that only Ilara could fully feel. She knew that fear was a powerful weapon, but also a double-edged sword. If the villagers became excessively fearful, they might unite, not to flee, but to confront what they considered a threat. Winter tightened its icy embrace. The cracks in the hut, no matter how much they tried to seal them with clay and moss, let the wind whisper tales of cold and despair. The smoke from the fire, a tenuous thread of life, rose through the makeshift chimney, a beacon for curious eyes, even if they were now eyes full of superstition. The need for supplies was a constant, relentless pressure that forced her to risk going to the village, even knowing that each appearance was a test of her act. Leah, with the sensitivity of her age, perceived her grandmother's burden. Her eyes, once full of childish sparkle, now carried a shadow of worry. She helped Ilara gather firewood, pile stones, mend blankets, but her mind wandered. "Grandma," she asked, as the steam of her breath mingled with the icy air, "why did Thomas come here? Was he afraid?" Ilara stopped, a bundle of firewood in her arms, and looked at her granddaughter. People are afraid of what they don't understand, Leah, and we, my dear, are a mystery to them now. She couldn't tell Leah the full truth, not yet. The secret was too heavy for a child's shoulders, but complicity in the deception was inevitable. Each morning, Ilara reinforced the legend. She spoke in a low voice about the restless spirits that inhabited the land, about the ancient king who did not want his sleep disturbed. She encouraged Maya to draw darker figures, to appease the guardians, she said, and Sophia, with her vivid imagination, began to see shadows and hear whispers in the wind that Ilara had planted in her mind. The hut, which was once a stone refuge, was transforming into a stage of mysteries. Ilara, with a piece of charcoal, drew a complex symbol on the most visible stone at the entrance, a spiral with angular lines, which she claimed was an ancient protection mark. In truth, it was her own invention, but the simple act of drawing it with solemnity under the watchful eyes of her granddaughters gave it an aura of authenticity. On her next trip to the village, Ilara not only bought supplies, but also sowed new seeds of fear. She approached a group of women spinning wool near the fountain. In a low voice and with a distant gaze, she murmured about the signs the earth was giving. "The ravens," she said, "they are no longer the same. Their eyes glow with a strange light, and they follow my steps like shadows." She spoke of a deep groan coming from the earth on the coldest nights, a sound that was neither wind nor animal. The women exchanged glances, their faces pale. Old Ilara, always so practical, now spoke like a prophetess of doom. The seed of fear took root. The story of the hunter Thomas, who had returned from the forest pale and mute, only reinforced the narrative. He didn't recount what he had seen, only shook his head, his eyes fixed on emptiness, a mute testimony to the terror that had seized him. Ilara knew that greed was a force more powerful than fear. Gold, even if cursed, was still gold. She needed a way to make the treasure not just dangerous, but undesirable. The legend of the ancient king, whose riches were buried, needed to be rewritten in the villagers' minds, not as a treasure to be found, but as a trap to be avoided. One night, Ilara had an audacious idea. She needed a more concrete sign, something that could be found, and that would directly link the gold to the curse. With Leah asleep beside her, Ilara unearthed a small portion of the chest. Carefully, she removed a single gold coin, the oldest and most worn she could find. With a hammer and a sharp stone, she hammered the coin, deforming it, engraving deep scratches and a small hole in it, as if it had been corroded by some malevolent power. The next day, under the pretext of looking for medicinal herbs, Ilara ventured a little further from the hut to a little used trail that led to the village. There, near a fallen log, she lost the deformed coin, burying it superficially so it would be easily found. If someone finds this, she thought, and hears the story of the curse, perhaps greed will be replaced by terror. A few days later, news reached the hut. A lumberjack had found a strange coin on the trail. It was gold, yes, but it was deformed, almost unrecognizable, and had a peculiar smell, like damp earth and something else, something ancient and putrid. The story spread like lightning. The coin was taken to the merchant, who examined it with suspicion. "It's gold," he admitted, "but it looks sick, as if the earth itself had rejected it." Ilara, hearing the story from a woman selling eggs, shook her head with staged sadness. "I warned you," she murmured. "The land here is ancient. What it gives, it also takes. And what it takes is the peace of the soul." Ilara's strategy was working, but with each step, she felt the weight of the lie. The stone hut, her sanctuary, was becoming a prison of secrets. Winter continued to tighten its grip, and with each gold coin spent, with each whisper spread, Elara knew she was playing a dangerous game. The permanence of the secret was not just a matter of hiding the gold, but of burying the truth so deeply that no one would dare unearth it. The war of wits was far from over, and Elara's next move would have to be even bolder, even more convincing, to finally drive away the hungry predators lurking on the edges of her new and dangerous home. The deformed coin became the center of conversations in the village. People looked at it with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. The merchant, a pragmatic man, tried to melt it, but the metal seemed to resist, releasing a dark vapor and an even stronger smell, which he described as the breath of death. The story, of course, reached Elara's ears, and she smiled bitterly. The deception was taking on a life of its own, but the deception came at a price. The girls, especially Leah and Sophia, began to be frightened by the very stories Elara invented. Sophia, the youngest, cried at night, convinced that the ancient king would come for them if they weren't good. Leah, older, watched her grandmother with a seriousness that belied her age. "Grandma," she whispered one night, as Elara mended a blanket by the flickering firelight, "what if the curse is real? What if the gold brings us more problems than solutions?" Elara felt a tightening in her chest. She had created a monster to ward off other monsters, but this new monster was scaring her own family. Winter deepened, bringing with it a sharper hunger and a cold that seemed to penetrate their bones. Even with the gold, trade in the village was limited. People, now more wary of Elara and anything that came from her lands, began to avoid dealing directly with her. The prices of the few items she could buy soared. The hut, however much of a refuge it was not immune to scarcity. Elara needed grain, salt, wool for new blankets. Each day, the gold chest, once a promise of security, seemed more like an anchor, binding them to a dangerous secret. One afternoon, as Elara tried to light the fire with damp firewood, she heard voices coming from the trail. They weren't whispers, but a heated discussion. She approached the door's crack, her heart pounding. It was 3 men from the village, including Tomas, the hunter, and the merchant, who had tried to melt the coin. "We can't ignore this, Tomas," the merchant blustered. "That old woman is crazy, but the gold is real. Cursed or not, it's gold. And what if she's hiding more?" Tomas, though still pale, seemed to have regained some of his original skepticism, mixed with a new kind of fear. "I saw something there, I swear. It wasn't human. But just, what if it's a trick? What if she's using our fear against us?" The third man, a burly farmer known for his greed, stomped his foot. "Trick or not, we can't let an old woman and 3 children sit on a fortune while we starve. If there's gold, it belongs to the village, or to whoever has the courage to take it." Elara felt a chill that didn't come from the wind. Greed was beginning to overcome fear. The deception of the deformed coin had worked to scare individuals, but now it threatened to unite the boldest and most desperate. They were no longer just afraid, they were questioning. And questioning was the first step to discovering the truth. She retreated from the door, her face contorted in an expression of dread and determination. The hut, her sanctuary, was under direct threat. She had planted seeds of fear, but now she needed a storm. It wasn't enough for the gold to seem cursed. The earth around the hut needed to become a place no one would dare tread. Elara knew she needed an event, something that would leave no doubt about the dangerous nature of that place, something that would speak to all senses, that would transform curiosity into paralyzing terror. Elara's next move would be the riskiest of all, and she knew there would be no turning back. Those voices, coming from the trail, were a somber premonition. Elara retreated from the door's crack, her heart pounding against her ribs like a war drum. Greed, she knew, was a hungry beast, and fear however much it contained it for a time, was no match for hunger. They weren't just questioning, they were preparing to act. The merchant, Thomas, the burly farmer, the union of covetousness and despair. Ilara felt a chill that didn't come from winter, but from the certainty that she needed a final act, a performance so convincing that it would transform curiosity into paralyzing terror. She looked at her granddaughters, asleep under the mended blankets, Sophia, with her angelic face, still frightened by the stories of the ancient king. Leah, more serious, with the weight of her grandmother's lies in her eyes. Maya, the most practical, but still a child. Ilara had created a monster to ward off others, but this monster was now scaring her own family. Guilt was a heavy burden, but the alternative, the loss of everything, misery returning, was unthinkable. That night, under the heavy cloak of darkness and the biting howl of the wind, Ilara began to plan her masterpiece of terror. She needed an event, something that would leave no doubt about the dangerous nature of that place. It wasn't enough for the gold to seem cursed. The earth around the hut itself needed to become a place no one would dare tread. With her granddaughters deeply asleep, Ilara slipped out of the hut. The icy air bit her skin, but adrenaline kept her alert. She moved like a shadow, an old witch weaving a protective spell. First, she went to the spot where the chest was buried, not to unearth it, but to collect the dark, damp earth that surrounded it. There was a peculiar smell there, an odor of mineral and decomposition that she had noticed from the beginning. Next, she ventured deeper into the forest, searching for ingredients. She found a bioluminescent fungus growing on rotten logs, emitting a faint greenish glow. She collected it carefully, crushing it into a paste. She also gathered some small animal bones, remnants of carcasses left by predators, and dry, hollow branches that the wind would make whistle. Her plan was to create a manifestation of the ancient king, an illusion that would appeal to all senses. She chose a strategic point on the trail leading to the hut, a spot where the vegetation was dense and the night shadows danced in a particularly sinister way. There, she began her macabre staging. With the hollow branches, she created a kind of wind flute, burying them partially in the ground and positioning them to catch the icy gusts, producing ghostly wails and whistles. The bones, she hung them on thin vine threads, swinging them gently to create a dry, clattering sound, like dragging footsteps or rattling bones. The bioluminescent fungus paste was spread on nearby stones and logs, creating ghostly points of light that seemed to float and move in the darkness, like watchful eyes or lost souls. And the smell. Ah, the smell. She dug a small hole, mixed the earth from the chest with some dry herbs and a piece of rancid meat she had saved for bait. She lit a small fire with embers, creating a dense, putrid smoke that would spread through the air, a breath of death that the merchant had described. Ilara worked all night, her aged but firm fingers shaping terror. When the first pale ray of sun began to tint the horizon, she was back in the hut, exhausted, but with a sense of cold determination. The girls were still asleep. She lay down, feigning deep sleep, but her mind was on high alert. The anticipation was torture. Ilara knew the men would come, greed would drive them, and doubt would make them cautious, but not enough. They would come to see for themselves, to unmask the crazy old woman and claim what they believed was theirs. Hours dragged on. The sun rose, but the cold persisted. The girls woke up and Ilara kept them busy with routine tasks, trying to disguise her own anxiety. She instructed them not to leave the hut for anything. "For the spirits are restless today," she said, her voice graver than usual. Late in the afternoon, the sound Ilara expected arrived. It wasn't the crunch of footsteps in the snow, but the distant bark of a dog, followed by muffled voices. They were approaching. Ilara felt a knot in her throat. She hugged her granddaughters one by one with unusual strength, as if saying goodbye. "Stay here, my dears," she whispered, "and no matter what you hear, do not come out." She positioned herself at the door's crack, peeking out at the trail. 3 figures materialized among the trees, moving with a mixture of hesitation and bravado. It was them, Thomas, the merchant, and the farmer. They carried torches whose flames danced nervously in the gathering twilight. As they approached the spot Ilara had prepared, the air around them seemed to change. The wind, which had only howled before, now seemed to whisper ancient names. The greenish points of light began to glow more intensely in the gloom. The putrid smell, which Ilara had created, intensified, mixing with the icy air and the smoke from the torches. The farmer, the burliest one, was the first to stop. "What's that smell?" he grunted, covering his nose. The merchant, paler, looked at the points of light. "What are those lights? They're not fireflies." Tomas, the hunter, was paralyzed. His eyes, already marked by previous terror, widened. He could hear the wind's wails through the hollow branches, the clattering of bones. To him, it wasn't a trick. It was the confirmation of his worst nightmare. A sharp, prolonged wail cut through the air, louder than the wind, deeper than any animal. It was the sound Ilara had rehearsed, a combination of natural elements and her own ingenuity. The men's torches flickered, almost going out. One of the bioluminescent light points, strategically placed on a swaying branch, seemed to move and grow, taking on a shapeless, ethereal form. The farmer let out a muffled cry. The merchant dropped his torch, which extinguished in the snow. Thomas, with a guttural sound of pure terror, turned and ran, stumbling in the snow, his screams echoing through the forest. The other 2, infected by panic, did not hesitate to follow him, leaving behind the ghostly glow and the smell of death. Ilara watched everything from the door's crack, her body trembling, but her heart feeling an icy relief. They had fled. The deception had worked. But as she turned to her granddaughters, she saw that they too were awake, their eyes wide with fear, listening to the distant screams of the men. The hut was safe, for now, but the price of safety was the terror that now inhabited the hearts of her own daughters. Ilara knew she had crossed a line. The next phase of her war would be against the fear she herself had sown in her family. And that battle, she feared, would be the hardest of all. The echo of the men's screams dissipated into the forest's darkness, carried by the icy wind, whistling through the bare branches. Ilara stepped away from the door's crack, her aged body trembling, no longer from the cold, but from the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. The deception had worked. They had fled. But the victory had a bitter taste, for as she turned, she saw the wide eyes of her granddaughters, fixed on her, filled with the terror she herself had planted. Sophia, the youngest, was huddled under the blankets, her angelic face contorted in silent sobs, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. Leah, the middle one, watched her grandmother with an intensity that seemed to see through her soul, a mixture of fear and a comprehension too early for her age. Maya, the eldest, though frightened, maintained an expression of shock, as if trying to process the distorted reality she had just witnessed. The men's screams, the wind's wails, the ghostly lights, everything had infiltrated the hut's security, which now seemed as fragile as a house of cards. Ilara felt a tightening in her chest, a pang of guilt that was more painful than any cold or hunger she had ever endured. She had promised to protect them, but she had used fear as a weapon, and the ricochet now struck the most vulnerable hearts. She knelt beside the girls, pulling them into a tight embrace, feeling their small bodies tremble. "Shh, my dears," she whispered, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion. "It's all right now. They're gone. The spirits. They drove them away." Leah lifted her face, her eyes damp but firm. "The spirits. Are they evil, Grandma?" Ilara hesitated. How to explain that the spirits were an invention, an orchestration of branches, fungi, and bones? How to undo the terror without revealing the truth about the gold, about the greed that pursued them? She needed to maintain the narrative, but transform it into a shield, not a sword, that would wound them. "No, my flower," she replied, kissing Leah's forehead. "They are not evil. They are the guardians of this land, of this place. They protect those who are pure of heart, who seek shelter and peace, but those who come with malice, with covetousness in their hearts. To them, the spirits show their fury. They scare them away so they never return." She looked at Sophia, who was still softly sobbing. "They protected you, my little ones. Protected our hut. They won't hurt you. This is our home, and inside we are safe." Maya, who had been silent until then, finally spoke, her voice a whisper. "But what were those lights, Grandma? And the smell?" "They are the signs, dear," Ilara replied, stroking Maya's hair. "The signs that this land is ancient, sacred. They manifest to ward off intruders. It's their way of saying, this place is not for you." She spent the rest of the night hugging them, telling soft stories about the earth's strength and the ancestors' protection, trying to replace the recent terror with a sense of mystical security. But she knew that the images and sounds of that night would not be easily erased. Fear, once sown, took deep root when the pale morning sun finally crept through the hut's cracks, bringing with it a heavy silence. The air still seemed dense with the night's memory. The putrid smell Ilara had created still lingered, faint but perceptible, a constant reminder of what had happened. The girls were calmer, but their eyes still held a gleam of apprehension. Ilara kept them busy, asking them to collect firewood inside the hut, to tidy the blankets, anything to distract them and keep them away from the door. As they worked, Ilara watched the forest through the door's crack. The trail was empty. The men's torches had gone out, and the snow covered their footprints. The staging had been a success, but Ilara knew it was only a palliative. Greed was not a monster that could be scared away forever with tricks and illusions. It was a persistent beast that would return, perhaps more cunning, more determined. She needed more. She needed a solution that was more than a temporary scare. As the girls played with a piece of wood, Ilara felt the weight of the gold chest beneath the earth, a silent and powerful presence that was the source of all her misery and her salvation. The gold was a curse and a blessing. She had transformed the earth into a guardian, but what would happen if the entire village, driven by desperation and covetousness, united? Ilara knew that the next phase of her war would not only be against the men of the village, but also against time. She needed a plan that would guarantee her granddaughter's long-term safety, a plan that depended not just on fear, but on an unquestionable truth, on an insurmountable barrier. She needed an event that would be so grand, so final, that no one would ever dare question the sacred and dangerous nature of that place. Her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the mountains rose, imposing and silent. There were ancient stories about those peaks, about hidden caves and secret passages. An idea, still nebulous, began to form in her tired mind. An idea that involved not only the protection of the hut, but the security of a future she could barely imagine. Ilara's war was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, and the next battle would require not only courage, but a cunning that would defy the very logic of survival. Ilara recalled the legends whispered around the campfires of her youth, tales of the forgotten king, an ancient monarch whose riches were as vast as his wisdom. It was said that he had built a final sanctuary deep within the mountains, a place of eternal rest for his most sacred treasures, protected not by traps, but by a curse as old as time, a curse that promised misfortune and madness to anyone who dared profane his slumber. And what if the gold they had found was not just a treasure, but a part of that legacy? What if the chest was a fragment of the forgotten king's sanctuary, lost and now found, crying out to return to its rightful place? The hut, then, would be merely a waypoint, a temporary refuge for an artifact that belonged to a much older and more powerful realm. This was the unquestionable truth Ilara sought. Not a temporary scare, but a living legend, a taboo. If she could link the gold to the forgotten king's curse, and more importantly, if she could move the chest to a location that appeared to be the final sanctuary, then no one would ever dare approach again. Greed would be overcome by ancestral dread, but the mountains were unforgiving, especially in winter. The chest was heavy, the journey dangerous. How could she, an elderly woman and 3 girls, undertake such a feat? She couldn't leave them alone, nor could she expose them to such great danger. The solution would have to be gradual, one step at a time. Ilara began to weave new stories for her granddaughters, no longer about spirits that scared, but about the great journey that the Earth's guardians demanded. A sacred pilgrimage to honor the ancient kings and ensure the eternal protection of their hut. She spoke of secret trails, of flowers that glowed in the dark, and of underground rivers, transforming imminent danger into a mystical adventure. She needed them to follow her not out of fear, but out of a sense of purpose and wonder. In the following days, Ilara began making small forays. She left the girls in the hut with strict instructions, while she herself, with an axe and a rope, explored the surroundings, not in search of firewood, but of roots, of natural landmarks that could lead to a place resembling the legendary sanctuary. She looked for caves, for unusual rock formations, for anything that could be shaped into a final destination for the gold. Time was her enemy. She knew that the courage of the village men, once recovered, would bring them back, perhaps in greater numbers and with greater determination. She needed to act fast, before greed overcame terror. The gold chest, silent beneath the hut's floor, seemed to pulse with its own energy, calling her to the mountain, to the destiny she was about to forge. The next phase of her war would be the most audacious, a race against time and against nature itself to transform a curse into salvation. Winter deepened, and with it Ilara's urgency. Each passing day was a reminder of the persistence of human greed. The village men, though frightened, would not be deterred forever by mere illusions. The forest, once a refuge, now seemed a labyrinth of imminent dangers, and the mountains, which once represented freedom, now loomed as an insurmountable challenge. Ilara began her morning forays, leaving the girls in the hut with the promise that the guardians would protect them. With a rustic axe and a rope coiled around her waist, she ventured onto the snow-covered trails, her steps heavy but determined. Each ascent was torture for her aged knees, each breath an effort in the thin, icy air. She sought not just a shelter, but a setting, a natural stage that could house the legend she was about to enact. She climbed slippery rocks, avoided snow-hidden precipices, and felt the biting wind whip her face, turning her tears of exertion into tiny ice crystals. Her eyes, once fixed on the ground, now swept the horizon in search of a cave, a crevice in the rocks, anything that could be interpreted as the final sanctuary of the forgotten king. Each day she returned exhausted, her hands calloused and her body aching, but without losing hope. The girls greeted her with tight hugs, their small faces eager for stories of secret trails and ancient signs. Ilara fed them tales of whispering stones and trees that guarded secrets, preparing their hearts for the great adventure approaching. The search was arduous. Many caves were too shallow, others collapsed, and some were inhabited by wild creatures that made her recoil with a shiver. Time was a luxury she didn't possess. Each day, the memory of the village men became more vivid, the threat more palpable. She knew they were regrouping, planning their return, perhaps in greater numbers and with greater determination. After almost a week of exhaustive exploration, Ilara found it. Hidden behind a curtain of ice and moss, on a steep and difficult-to-access slope, was a dark crevice in the rock. As she squeezed inside, she discovered a small cave, not very deep, but with a peculiar rock formation in the center, resembling a natural altar. The air inside was cold and damp, but strangely calm, and the echo of her own footsteps seemed to get lost in an ancestral silence. It was perfect, with some strategically placed stones and dry moss to create a more ancient atmosphere. She could transform it into the sanctuary she needed. But the joy of discovery was quickly replaced by harsh reality: how to move the chest. The treasure was too heavy for a single person, let alone an elderly and frail woman. She needed help, but she couldn't risk her granddaughter's safety by exposing them to brutal effort or the mountain's danger. The idea of unearthing the gold in pieces and transporting it in several trips was unfeasible. Time was short, and the forest was not a safe place to leave parts of the treasure unprotected. Ilara spent the night awake, the weight of the chest beneath the hut's floor seeming to crush her own chest. She needed a solution that was fast and efficient. Her eyes swept the hut, stopping at the few belongings they had managed to save: blankets, some pots, and the rope she used for her explorations. And then, her mind, sharpened by necessity, found a spark. She remembered how the ancient builders of her village moved enormous stones, using tree trunks as rollers and levers. It was a rudimentary but effective technique. If she could build a kind of improvised sled, perhaps she could drag the chest. The idea was audacious, almost insane, but it was the only one she had. The next morning, Ilara began to work with renewed determination. While the girls played near the fire, she used her axe to cut thick, sturdy branches, stripping them and tying them with rope to create a flat, robust platform. She explained to the girls that they were building a magic cart for the Guardians, which would help them carry the gifts to the sanctuary. They, with the innocence of childhood, helped collect the smaller branches, believing they were part of a grand game. The work was exhausting. Each blow of the axe reverberated in her bones. Each knot in the rope demanded a strength she barely possessed. But the image of her granddaughter's terrified faces and the sight of the village men returning spurred her on. She needed to be stronger, more cunning. Ilara's war was not just a battle for survival, but a forging of her own resilience. When the improvised sled was ready, Ilara felt a mix of pride and despair. It was crude, but it seemed strong enough. The next step was the most dangerous: unearthing the chest and moving it. She knew she couldn't do it alone. For the first time, Ilara considered the possibility of involving the girls more directly, but still protected. They couldn't know the truth about the gold, but they could be part of the sacred pilgrimage. Night fell, bringing with it a biting cold and the promise of a new day of challenges. Ilara felt the weight of the gold chest beneath the hut's floor, a silent and powerful presence that was the source of all her misery and her salvation. The next phase of her war would be the most audacious, a race against time and against nature itself to transform a curse into salvation. She looked at her granddaughters, sleeping deeply, and whispered, "This is our journey, my little ones, and together we will rewrite our destiny." The mountain waited, and with it the fate of a family and an ancestral treasure. Ilara knew that dawn would bring not only light, but the need for a strength she didn't even know she possessed. Dawn arrived, not with the promise of a new beginning, but with the icy urgency of an ultimatum. Ilara felt the day's weight on her hunched shoulders even before opening her eyes. The gold chest, a silent and imposing presence beneath the hut's floor, seemed to vibrate with its own energy, propelling her to action. She rose, her bones creaking in protest, and watched her granddaughters sleeping. their innocent faces illuminated by the faint light of the dying fire. It was for them that she would do the impossible. With a sigh that turned into vapor in the cold air, Ilara began preparations. She gently woke the girls, their sleepy eyes blinking at the world. "Today is the great day, my little guardians," she whispered, her voice hoarse but filled with a mystical authority. "The ancient kings call us to the pilgrimage. We need to take our sacred gifts to the sanctuary so that the mountain continues to protect us." The girl's eyes widened. The idea of a pilgrimage and sacred gifts was a grand game, an adventure Ilara had skillfully woven into their minds. They dressed in the warmest clothes they had, their hearts beating with a mixture of excitement and reverence. Ilara instructed them to collect the few dried flowers they had saved, some colorful pebbles, and even a piece of bread, which would be the gifts for the guardians. While they busied themselves with their innocent task, Ilara knelt over the spot where the chest was buried. With the axe, she began to loosen the frozen earth, her muscles protesting with each blow. The sound was muffled, but the effort was brutal. With each shovelful of earth removed, the tension increased. What if someone was watching? What if the village men had returned in the dead of night? Paranoia was a constant shadow, but Ilara couldn't afford to hesitate. After a Herculean effort, the wooden lid of the chest appeared. The faint light entering the hut's door reflected on the gold, an opaque, ancient gleam. Ilara felt a shiver. It wasn't just wealth, it was a burden, a curse. Very carefully, she removed the remaining earth and tried to lift the chest. It was impossible. The weight was overwhelming. Her arms trembled, and a sharp pain pierced her back. "Grandma, what is this?" Leah's voice, the eldest, cut through the silence. Ilara turned, her face pale and sweaty. "It's the great gift, my dear. It's too heavy for Grandma alone. You need to help me put it on the magic cart." The girls, without questioning, approached. Ilara instructed them to push from one side while she pulled from the other, using the rope tied to the chest. With a combined effort and the agonizing creak of the wood, the chest slowly slid out of the hole. The hut's floor was marked, but the treasure was exposed. Dragging the chest to the improvised sled was another battle. Every inch was a victory. Ilara used small logs as rollers, an ancient technique that required patience and strength. The girls, with their youthful energy, helped position the rollers and push, laughing and singing, oblivious to the true meaning of their task. Ilara watched them, her heart heavy with the need to deceive them, but grateful for their help. When the chest was finally secure on the sled, tied with the rope, Ilara felt a momentary relief, but the journey was still to come. The mountain waited, relentless and treacherous. She took her axe, the girls took their gifts, and together they left the hut, the icy air cutting their lungs. The snow was deeper than Ilara remembered. Every step was a struggle. The sled, with its colossal weight, sank, and Ilara had to pull with all her might, her feet slipping, her muscles burning. The girls, in turn, tried to help by pushing the back of the sled, their small hands rubbing the rough wood. "Come on, Grandma, the guardians are waiting," they cried, their voices thin and full of enthusiasm. The ascent was steep. Ilara chose the most hidden route, a trail she had mentally marked during her forays. The wind whipped their faces, and the cold penetrated their clothes. Ilara felt sweat run down her back, freezing beneath her garments. Her knees ached, her breathing was ragged, but the image of the village men, with their greed and cruelty, was an invisible whip that spurred her on. Hours passed. The sun, which had begun to rise timidly, was now high in the sky, but its warmth was illusory. The girls, though tired, kept their spirits up. Ilara encouraged them with stories of the signs they were finding. An animal track in the snow, a broken branch, everything became part of the mystical narrative of the pilgrimage. After what seemed an eternity, Ilara spotted the curtain of ice and moss that hid the cave entrance. A cry of relief escaped her lips, but it was quickly muffled by the wind. "We've arrived, my little ones. The sanctuary of the ancients." The last part of the journey was the hardest. The slope was steep and slippery. Ilara had to use the rope to tie the sled to a tree and, with superhuman effort, pull it inch by inch. The girls, frightened by the difficulty, clung to her, but Ilara reassured them, saying it was the Guardian's last test. With a final push, the sled slid into the dark crevice. The air inside the cave was even colder, but it offered refuge from the biting wind. Ilara lit a small torch she had brought, and the flickering light revealed the rock formation that resembled an altar. "Here it is, my loves," Ilara said, her voice echoing in the ancestral silence, "the resting place of the sacred gifts." With the last of her remaining strength, Ilara and the girls pushed the chest to the center of the cave, positioning it on the natural altar. Ilara then began to arrange the stones and dry moss she had collected on her previous forays, transforming the cave into a convincing setting for a forgotten sanctuary. The girls, with solemnity, placed their flowers and pebbles around the chest, making their own offerings. When finished, Ilara stepped back, observing her work. The gold chest, now wrapped in moss and surrounded by ancient stones, seemed part of the mountain itself, a relic from a forgotten time. The curse, the legend, the truth she was forging seemed palpable in the cave's icy air. The journey back to the hut was faster, but no less exhausting. The girls, though tired, were full of stories about the pilgrimage and the guardians. Ilara listened to them, a tired smile on her face. The chest was safe for now. But Ilara's war was not over. She had moved the treasure, but now she needed to move the minds of men, transforming greed into dread. The mountain had accepted her gift, and now she hoped the legend she had planted would flourish, protecting her family from a danger far more real than any spirit or curse. Winter deepened, and with it, the need to solidify the unquestionable truth. The air in the hut, though cold, felt lighter. Ilara felt a momentary relief, but exhaustion was a heavy cloak on her shoulders. The girls, with their faces flushed from the cold and eyes shining with adventure, talked endlessly about the guardians and the santuario. Ilara listened to them, a tired but genuine smile framing her lips. Their innocence was her greatest weapon, the purity of their stories, the poison she would plant in the men's minds. But first and foremost, she needed to erase the tracks. The hole in the hut's floor, where the chest had been, was an open wound in her deception. With the last of her remaining strength, Ilara began to work. She gathered the loose earth, compacting it with her feet, using moss and stones to disguise the area. She spread ashes from the dying fire and even some dry branches, making it look as if the ground had merely been disturbed by her in search of firewood or by some curious animal. It wasn't perfect, but in the hut's gloom and under an intruder's hasty glance, it might pass. The days that followed were filled with silent tension. Ilara instructed the girls to continue the game of pilgrimage, to speak of the guardians and the signs the mountain gave them. "The mountain speaks to us, my little ones," she whispered, "and it protects us, but it doesn't like those who don't respect its secrets." The girls absorbed every word, their childish minds transforming the warning into another element of their fantasy. They told stories to their rag dolls, to the squirrels that dared approach the hut, and to themselves, solidifying the narrative. Ilara, in turn, began to weave a web of omens. She spoke aloud about strange dreams, about the wind that sang warnings, about the snow that seemed to have a different glow, small things, almost imperceptible, but which together would begin to build the unquestionable truth. She knew that the men's greed would bring them back. It was only a matter of time, and when they came, the mountain would already be speaking to them, even before Ilara opened her mouth. The weight was agonizing. Every creak of wood, every breath of wind seemed like a premonition of their arrival. Ilara spent sleepless nights, sitting near the fire, the axe by her side, her eyes fixed on the door. She had prepared some simple traps around the hut, unstable piles of stones that would fall with a touch, dry branches that would break under the weight of an inattentive foot, creating loud noises. Nothing that would injure, but enough to scare, to make a superstitious man's heart pound. Lie. On the third day after the chest's move, the shadow Ilara expected appeared. 3 dark figures stood out against the snow, ascending the trail towards the hut. They were the same men, led by the one with the scarred face, the personification of their misery. Ilara felt a chill down her spine, but it wasn't from fear. It was the adrenaline of the imminent battle. She took the axe, her only faithful friend, and hid it under a blanket near where she was sitting. The girls, oblivious to the real threat, played quietly with their dolls. The men approached, their heavy footsteps breaking the mountain's silence. The leader, with his harsh voice, called out, "Old woman, we know you hid something. Where is the gold?" Ilara didn't answer immediately. She waited, letting the silence stretch, increasing the tension. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost a whisper, but laden with an ancestral authority. The gold is not mine nor yours. The gold belongs to the mountain." The men laughed, a dry, cruel sound that echoed in the icy air. "The mountain? The mountain has no pockets, old woman. Where did you hide it?" They entered the hut, their hungry eyes sweeping the interior. Ilara watched, her eyes fixed on them, unblinking. They inspected the floor, kicked the few belongings, greed distorting their faces. The leader knelt at the spot where the chest had been, sniffing the air, his fingers digging superficially into the earth. "Here, something was here. The ground has been disturbed," he growled, his voice full of triumph. But Ilara was ready. "Yes," she said, her voice still low. "The mountain stirred the ground. It was angry. It doesn't like to be disturbed. The girls and I had to make a pilgrimage to appease it, to take our gifts to the guardians." The girls, hearing the word pilgrimage, lifted their heads, their large, innocent eyes fixed on the men. "Yes, the guardians were waiting," Leah exclaimed with the purity of a child who believes every word. "We took flowers and pebbles to the sanctuary." The men exchanged glances, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. The mention of guardians and sanctuary coming from the children, without any trace of malice, was unsettling. The leader, however, was more resistant. "Nonsense, old woman, you're crazy. We won't fall for your witches' tales." But he didn't seem so confident. They began to search the area around the hut, but with less conviction, their eyes more attentive to the signs than to tracks. They stumbled into Ilara's traps, each noise, each rolling stone, increasing their nervousness. The wind, which had intensified, howled through the trees, seeming to whisper forgotten names. Ilara watched from afar, the girls nestled near her, not understanding the gravity of the situation. She knew that the seed of doubt had been planted. Greed was still there, but now it was mixed with a primitive fear, a superstition that the village men, despite their brutality, had never truly abandoned. They found nothing. The snow, which had fallen again the previous night, covered any more obvious traces. As nightfall approached and the cold became unbearable, the men finally decided to retreat. "We'll be back, old woman. Don't think you've fooled us," the leader shouted, but his voice lacked its former conviction. They descended the trail. Their steps hurried, almost as if they were fleeing from something invisible. Ilara felt a sigh of relief, but knew it was only a truce. The war had not ended, but the first psychological battle had been won. The unquestionable truth was beginning to take shape. The mountain, through Ilara and the innocence of her granddaughters, had spoken. And fear, more powerful than greed, began to take root in the hearts of men. Winter deepened, and with it the legend of the mountain and its cursed treasure. The night's cold swallowed the last echoes of hurried footsteps, leaving behind only the heavy silence of the mountain. Ilara watched the men's shadows disappear into the darkness, a trembling sigh escaping her lips. The victory was hers for now, but the war, she knew, was far from over. The seed of fear had been planted, but greed was a resilient weed, capable of suffocating any flower of dread, if not constantly watered. She imagined the men descending the trail, their minds disturbed by the events at the hut. The leader, the most skeptical, would try to rationalize, but his companions, especially the youngest, were already swayed. They would arrive in the village with a story, and that story, however much they tried to contain it, would spread. Ilara needed to ensure that the version that reached everyone's ears was hers. Soon, the story spread, gaining new details with each mouth that told it. The gold was not just a treasure, it was a treasure of an ancient king, guarded by spirits and protected by the mountain itself. Whoever touched it would be cursed. At first, greed was still strong. Some braver or more foolish men began to climb the trail, drawn by the promise of wealth. But Ilara was ready. Her traps were now more elaborate, not just stones and branches, but small visual spells. Old cloths hanging from trees, swaying in the wind like ghosts. Piles of animal bones, arranged to look like a warning and, most effectively, sound. Ilara had built small wind chimes with branches and stones, which with the icy breeze produced a ghostly wail that echoed through the trees. The snow melted with the arrival of spring, but the legend remained, more solid than the mountain stones. The villagers, once moved by greed, now avoided the hut's trail, casting apprehensive glances at the peaks. The mountain was no longer just an elevation of earth. It was a sacred realm, guarded by a wise old woman and its spirits. The stone hut, once a symbol of despair, transformed into a beacon of resilience, a silent testament to the power of belief and love. The girls grew up, their laughter echoing across the slopes, mingling with the birds' song and the wind's murmur. They knew every secret of the mountain, every hidden trail, every sign their grandmother had created. For them, the mountain was a living home, a protective friend, and the legend, the unquestionable truth of their existence. The gold chest remained untouched, a secret guarded with reverence, its silent presence ensuring the safety and freedom they had won. Ilara, her hair white as winter snow, watched her granddaughters play, her heart filled with a peace that seemed unshakable. The mountain had given them a home, and the legend, a life. And so, in the heart of the mountain, the old widow and her 3 granddaughters lived, forever protected by the story they themselves had woven.